Good afternoon and welcome to Teaching and Learning TV. We are here at the 10th Annual University of KwaZulu-Natal Teaching and Learning Conference, and we have a lovely distinguished panel of guests this afternoon here to talk to us about the scholarship of teaching and learning. First up we have Professor Steve Olivier, who is the Deputy Vice Chancellor at Abertay University in Scotland. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks very much. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you.
Great. I'm delighted to have you. Steve, perhaps you want to tell us something about what you'd like, just a snapshot of what you'd like to engage us in discussion this afternoon.
Yeah, I suppose I'm here under false pretenses in some ways because I'm not sure how much I can speak about the pure scholarship per se of teaching and learning, but more as I'm an agent of change in teaching and learning in terms of my role in the university. And we've undergone very deliberately some profound changes in our teaching and learning practice at our university in the last few years. I'm pleased to be able to say that it's all sort of principles-based. What might be more doubtful is whether it's purely educational scholarship-based in a research context. But it has, in terms of many indices of success, been very fruitful for us.
Great. So we'd love to hear more about that example and talk a little bit more about that. Professor Brenda Leibowitz, from the Chair of Teaching and Learning at the University of Johannesburg. We're very pleased to have you with us this afternoon. Welcome.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. What interests me quite a lot in my own work is the scholarship of teaching and learning and its relationship with social justice, or what the intersections of those two topics are. The second thing that I'm currently quite interested in is what scholarship of teaching and learning in the South might mean, and whether that might be different or similar to scholarship of teaching and learning more generally.
Thank you, Brenda. I think certainly in our current context and what's just happening outside of these doors in terms of the calls for decolonization, etc., your particular interests would be of significance to this discussion. So thank you. I look forward to talking to you. Professor Lee Shulman, who's Professor Emeritus of Education at Standford University, also President Emeritus of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. Welcome.
Thank you. It's my first time in this wonderful country, and it's lovely. A privilege to be here. I think what would best capture what I'd like to speak about was the experience I had a number of years ago when I was simultaneously leading two all-university committees at Stanford University. One was the all-university committee for the promotion and tenure of all faculty across the university, from engineering to medicine to classics. And at the same time, I was leading the all-university committee for the evaluation and improvement of teaching. And what came to me very clearly was that in reviewing faculty for promotion and tenure, really all that matters were their publications in peer-reviewed journals. Whether anybody read those articles or not, as long as they had been published. At the same time, some faculty members were engaged in beautiful, creative work on teaching. Much of it, even then, Brenda, directed at social justice, ends in the fields of education, sociology, medicine. But teaching brought them no credit at all as far as promotion and tenure were concerned, and I found myself getting angrier and angrier and more frustrated.
And hence your interest in the scholarship of teaching and learning and developing that.
Yes.
I'd love to talk more about that. Professor Jenny Case, Professor of Academic Development in the Department of Chemical Engineering at the University of Capetown. Welcome.
Thank you, welcome. Welcome to me. Oh, I said the wrong thing. Cut. No, thank you very much. It's great to be here. I've been aware of this conference for so long, and it's my first time here, and 10 years is quite something in terms of what this has come to be on the landscape. It's a very significant event. And it's a real honor to follow on Lee Shulman, whose work I've followed for a long time and has been influential at so many levels. And I guess what I want to contribute today is maybe to trouble things a little bit, I certainly understand, as you note, the issue that Scholarship of Teaching and Learning tried to address was the fact that teaching didn't seem to count for anything in university. But I do worry that in some of its workings out, especially in a context like ours, where journal publications are now driving a whole lot of behaviors, some of which have even been called perverse by our very own Department of Higher Education and Training in looking at how subsidies are allocated. That Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, I worry if there is some of the push is a very good one in terms of valuing things for promotion. But I guess I speak here, I'm a coordinating editor in the journal Higher Education. It's an international journal. And I weekly get a lot of articles written from, so this is not a South African issue, colleagues around the world who are university lecturers who are writing articles around their teaching. Some of them are useful, but a lot of them are not, in my view, offering knowledge to anyone in particular. And my real worry, to be quite straightforward here, is that people are spending an enormous amount of time on activities that, firstly, I don't think are building knowledge in the area of higher education or education, and I fear is an activity that is not connected to teaching, but is something different. And so, yeah, I want to stir the pot a little bit around Scholarship of Teaching and Learning.
Okay, so maybe that's a good space to begin with, perhaps. The utility of Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. What is its value? And certainly raises questions around the focus on research, the dichotomy between research and teaching. What does it mean to begin to publish research on your teaching? Because certainly that's what's under the microscope, if you like. So, any thoughts on that from the panel?
I think it's a very legitimate issue that Jenny's bringing up, because the minute you start taking it into the public sphere and trying to use it to compete with other articles on education, then it's found lacking often because it's not as theoretically based, or this pressure to have something that's original, which isn't really, I mean, if we're trying to push people to be scholarly about their teaching, and you go one step further and you say, you know, if you publish on this, you're going further, because you're not just doing something, you're sharing it with a larger group of people, and you're being more systematic about how you're analyzing it. That must be a good thing. But then you get this pressure now to compete against other people who've got a niche in this area and who are being original or more theoretically based. So I think Jenny's hit upon a really important issue.
It's an important, but Jenny, if I remember correctly in what you sent me, and I think you're drawing on Lee Shulman's work of the differences, and if I recall correctly, it was Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, educational research, and
scholarly teaching. And then they seem, and perhaps Lee, you would want to expand and tell us a little bit more about how you make those distinctions and the value of those for our conversation here.
Well, as perhaps Jenny and I will explore tomorrow in a 3-hour conversation
Lovely.
that I hope will not be just between the two of us. I try not to spend a lot of time making those distinctions.
Okay.
I consider these things to be on a spectrum, on a continuum. And I think, you know, be careful about what you wish for, because it can kind of turn into something very insidious. And to the extent that what Brenda and Jenny, sorry, have described, the sanctification of this work in journals may be precisely what we'd rather not have happen. What I was most worried about was the epidemic character of pedagogical amnesia. That what you had was people doing extraordinary work in the development, the creation, the adaptation of wonderful courses and revising them and doing exactly the sort of thing the human mind was apparently created for, and nobody else knowing about them. It was as if they were occurring in Harry Potter's invisibility cloak, because there were no vehicles for other members of the academic community to learn from one another with regard to teaching.
Right.
That's what I was worried about. The insidious thing that happened is precisely what Jenny and Brenda have described, is this immediately transmuted into, that means they must appear in academic journals, which is a lovely way often to kill creativity and its utility to be free and available to the colleagues who need it.
But certainly for someone like yourself, Steve, in university leadership, the increasing pressure to have works published, to give value to something that academics are engaged in, to tick those boxes, as we know in managerialist universities. Does it not just give academics then an opportunity to get credit, if you like, for something that they're doing anyway? Is that?
I guess I recognize the situation that all three of you have either described or nodded in agreement to, that my own university situation is slightly different. All universities have got strategic plans. Most of them are far too long. Most of them are horrible. We've got a mercifully short one. And for me, the phrase that I both insisted on putting in there and that I cherry pick and use a lot is that we will choose our own path. So we don't really do that sort of stuff. Yes, for our promotions panels, we want to know what you've published in. We want to know what your H index is, etc., etc. We want to know all that stuff. But we get people promoted to senior positions, for example, senior lecturer or be principal lecturer in English universities and so on the basis of excellent, good, innovative stuff that they have done in the classroom. And it could be that those things that we want that sort of knowledge to be disseminated, so we do it internally. Very, very successful teaching and learning seminar series. We get, in a small university, we'll get 80 to 100 people every single second week to a teaching and learning enhancement seminar. And nationally, as long as they disseminate that knowledge through something like the Higher Education Academy and so on. But we do not have a situation where we expect, it's just really exciting stuff, but exciting stuff that works for the students. That's really the way. So I could think of many instances of people who do not have a PhD, and incidentally, I think the UK percentage of academic staff with PhDs is something like 48%. My university is 66%. But having said that, I can think of many examples recently where somebody without a PhD, without any significant publication record, has got senior promotion. So that's the way we try and it's a very, very strong focus on teaching and learning that benefits our students that we focus on. And that contributes to promotion, for example.
But I think what I hear being said is I mean, what I hear being foregrounded is the notion of knowledge sharing. Right? So how do we, if we have these good practices, how do we share it in a way? So, but and the way in which scholarship of teaching and learning has been developed is to not just share that knowledge in perhaps a narrative sequence, as could easily be done, but to theorize that, and that's what makes it scholarship, right? But I hear you, Brenda, saying that sometimes that theorization might be poor.
Well,
or might not compete. Jenny?
No, Brenda, go for it. I'll chip it after you.
No, I don't want to say it's poor, but I'm just saying that people have to then publish according to the rules of the game. So it's not the rules of what will support your students and make you more thoughtful necessarily.
Right.
It's the rules to be competitive in that domain. So it's pushing you a bit further. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, because if you want to make claims about your teaching, you should be able to back it up in a scholarly way. So it's not that it's bad, but it's that you're doing it possibly for the wrong reasons. Maybe I can just back up on that point for a moment and say that, and I'd be interested to hear your views on this, but a lot of people or places where the scholarship of teaching and learning is pushed are places where people have already got excellence or are very accomplished in their disciplinary area. So this is something you do for your love of teaching. Whereas what happens in some South African universities, where the scholarship, even of the discipline, isn't as advanced as it should be, is the head of department says to the staff, you guys aren't publishing enough, you don't have enough PhDs, why don't you publish in your teaching? So it's a shortcut.
It becomes a shortcut, right.
And that's one of the perversities that I think is coming up, where in some, especially perhaps universities of technology or places where the disciplines are still not that advanced in terms of rules of scholarship.
So it ends up having the opposite effect, actually, in Chile.
Well, I mean, you just said that so well, Brenda. And I mean, Steve, it's really interesting what you say. And I think for me, the basic, what makes a university in the first instance is teaching and what it does to produce graduates who leave it. And I have to say that it's a tragedy that we're sitting on this day and there's no teaching happening on your campus or mine.
Yes.
And I feel really deeply distressed about that. I had to write to first years last night to tell them there's no test today, they've been studying the weekend. So, sorry, I have to say that. That's what really, and in the US you have some top-end universities who don't do much research at all. So our thing of always thinking, you know, teaching focused is low quality, you know, one needs to look elsewhere around that.
Right.
If you know, and it's a relatively recent thing, it's a kind of almost a generation thing, this huge push now, everybody must be research productive. And that's happening at the same time that we're expanding higher education, so we've got many more lecturers, and there's an assumption that they're all going to be generating significant knowledge. And I suppose your thing of saying original, I do think there is a thing of, I think everything, certainly not everything I've ever done deserves publication. Sometimes you try something out and you realize it's not going to make anybody happy or not going to be helpful. So I would go back to, you know, what you're saying, Steve, which is, you know, what are your, and actually your original position, what are the promotion rules? And I've been in a faculty where over the last decade or so there's been a significant shift about the requirement for demonstrating. Actually, to be honest, it's in that typology to be excellent teaching, not even necessarily scholarly teaching. I even want to interrogate a little bit later. And we now have a sub-minimum on teaching for appointment to associate professor and professor. It involves not only quality of what you do, and importantly there, it's about being able to show a trajectory of how you built up your expertise in teaching. It's not just you walk into the job and you're brilliant, as we all know. Yes. University teaching is a professional area of expertise. And I think so we're sometimes trying to not solve the one, if you want to say, problem. You know, the problem is the valuing of teaching, and the valuing of teaching as a complex, demanding activity. We're trying to solve it through another, I hate that word incentive. I was actually thinking this morning, I don't want that word incentive to be used in a university, in a professional place. It's like what you do.
Yeah.
Part of the issue, I think there's two problems with what I think you might have been saying, Brenda, this issue of publish your teaching, sort of thing, publish about your teaching. I think that's got two pretty negative effects. The first, it further downgrades the scholarship of teaching and learning. But the other thing is it's actually potentially just quite unfair towards individuals. It's like my discipline's philosophy. It'd be like saying, okay, we'll start publishing in chemical engineering.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just ludicrous.
You mean because you're having to cross over into the language of education?
Exactly.
Proper research and education, if that's what they're saying. Exactly. That would be fundamentally unfair, I think. It's different if you're just publishing in your discipline on teaching practices, perhaps.
But that would depend also on your views on disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity,
Yeah,
right?
I would make two observations here. First of all, this is an extraordinary conversation, and you're giving us about 4 hours to pursue this.
Of course, yes.
But first of all, I can't agree more with Brenda's observation about there are some standards of quality that have to be adhered to. Whether you're doing a single case study or an international survey, it's of no value to our colleagues in the field if they're going to learn from our efforts if the work we do that documents and analyzes, whether theorizes about or conceptualizes about it, is sloppy and undisciplined. So I agree entirely that there has to be discipline to this work. With regard to Steve's concern about, but if I were trained in medicine, how can I do educational research? You know, my brother-in-law, who is a distinguished clinical immunologist, took a year off in the middle of his career to go to London to learn new techniques and new theories with regard to the immune response. And any good scholar, even if she is staying within her domain, recognizes the need to learn new things. And a chemical engineer or a physician who wants to learn more about how do people learn to make medical diagnoses, for example, will recognize that she needs to get some more background and training in doing this kind of work, and had better get it, and not try to do it with their left hand while dancing.
That would be a good university that would be able to allow people the time to do that.
And in fact subsidize them to do it.
Indeed, a very reflective and socially responsible and educationally responsible. It raises an interesting thing for me in terms of how we make decisions in university leadership about what changes to apply. Forgetting about how to implement them, which is a completely different story in itself, and getting buy-in from people and so on. But whether these decisions, I guess you were speaking about learning from research in the field. I'm not sure that I can think of a single of the 120 odd UK universities, my peers at DVC or Vice President in your terms level, I can't think of a single one whose discipline is education. I'm sure there are a few. But so there are engineers, actually lots of engineers, some people from business studies, etc., a few philosophers dotted here and there. I'm not sure that I can think of one who's an educationalist per se. I'm sure there are some. But that's not problematical in itself. What might be more problematical is if people in my positions are not paying any attention to the educational bases in which they make their decisions about education. And that's quite common, I suspect.
That's what I was going to say. Can I be rude? And so I think one of the problems is that a lot of people who are DVC at that level don't apply educational basis to their decision making.
But certainly in the field of academic development, that's the concern, isn't it? Has been a concern, at least at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, I know that the concern and the concern gave rise to a whole induction program now for, it's called the University Education Induction Program, for all academics, a certain level and below have to undergo to enable them to become proficient as teachers. So, there's a module on assessment, and I know there's a module on supervision research and, supervising research, etc., which has been met with, quite a fair deal of opposition from academics when they were asked to do it, but most people who undergo it actually come out and say, wow, that has been quite great for me. But the assumption that because you have a PhD in your discipline, you know what to do in front of the classroom is a scary one, I think, because we know why we then might have really bad teachers too, right? Because being proficient in your discipline and having gone up to PhD level in your discipline in immunology or whatever doesn't necessarily translate into you being a good teacher. And what does that mean, So going back and reflecting on that might be, and maybe you might share something about what that means for academic development in your context.
Yeah, well, we've got Lee Shulman sitting here. I feel like I don't know if I can mention there was knowledge about teaching and knowledge.
Go for it.
No, I've just been it's just such an honor when you've worked with someone's work to kind of have the real person
She's
here.
a bit starstruck here.
I'm definitely being starstruck. No, it's great. It's a real pleasure.
And in front of the TV camera too.
You can capture it. But so the thing that I grappled with in trying to, part of my one issue with scholarship teaching and learning was this hey man, easy route to publications and all that. The other thing is about what knowledge is needed for teaching. And on this, Lima's picked this up from me, but I think we've we've been influenced by a sort of sciencey model of technology transfer and so on. You know, that there's like journal articles out there, and then the teacher will read them and apply the best techniques. You know, an assumption also sometimes that these are kind of generic. And I think people studying school teaching have done a lot more work on this, and it's really complicated. I mean, in any professional area, how do professionals use knowledge is such a not sorted out sort of area of thinking. It's very complex, and especially so for teaching. You know, where in law or medicine, there's this kind of body of knowledge, and everybody knows what it is that the lawyers have access to, and then what is the knowledge that informs teaching? But and you've put out such a very compelling, dare I say, typology. You say just now you're not so into typologies, but at any rate, with this idea, particularly at the center around pedagogical content knowledge. So it's how you bring your disciplinary knowledge together with some understandings about pedagogy. And I think so this is my worry again, that we're kind of thinking that, you know, university lecturers will like take off the shelf the top 10, you know, articles, the top cited articles on how to teach X, and like apply it, where actually it's quite complicated. And I mean, the piece that I did to try and unpack this, I was lucky to have this very weird experience that at one point in my life I was researching student learning in a course in chemical engineering, and in fact that was my PhD study. And then it was a decade later where I finally got my fingers on the course to teach it. And then it was about another 10 years later that I sort of sat back and I thought it was interesting to compare these two pieces of work I did. Because you would think if it was transfer, you know, I would have found out what to do in my PhD, and then I would have implemented it. You would think at least within one person they would do that. And when I looked at, with a bit of distance, what was I doing as a teacher, the stuff that really made a difference, to be honest, is not, I do think it can be shared. But it's different sorts of concerns to those I had as a researcher on student learning. A lot of it, actually, to be honest, is quite logistical. And by this, I don't mean to say it's trivial. I think that these realities of having limited time, 120 students, a venue that looks like X and Y, a bit of technology that you can use in particular ways, some resources, how are you going to make it happen? And I mean, some people, let me just say one last thing, then I'll just stop throwing bombs in here, but I know people who have been very good education researchers and not good teachers. Or you could say lecturers. And okay, let me just step back. I think you must pick up at knowledge for teaching.
I know great medical researchers to whom I would not subject my influenza. I mean, practice is messy.
Exactly.
The beauty of theory is it's clean. And theory makes, can I give an example?
Of course, please.
I have a colleague who has a joint appointment in education and physics at Standford. And at one point, while teaching an introduction to physics course to undergraduates who are not going to major in physics, the sort of course we call, you know, physics for poets, but of course they weren't all become. And the students were learning beautifully, but he was also studying educational references. And what was brought to his attention is that the realm of the intellect is the only important, not the only important object of education. Are you alert to the development of attitudes, values, emotional reactions? Now that's not the result, that's not, first of all, a how-to. It's not technical, but it sort of broadens the horizons. It's a notion of knowing how to look, which a lot of education is about. It teaches us how to look. And so he worked with a colleague in education and developed a very simple attitude scale, adapted from some that had been used. And he tried it out with his students, and what he discovered to his dismay was that as student intellectual success grew in his course, their attitudes towards science actually diminished. And they would say things like, well, this is a good course, but I never want to take a course in physics again. Which meant that he then redesigned the course based on that information, with a focus very much on the attitudinal aspects. And because he was getting actual data about his teaching, he was able to reverse those trends. Now, it didn't hurt in terms of the visibility of his work, Carl Wyman also had a Nobel Prize in physics.
Yeah.
Well, it gave him an audience, that's fine. But the point is, for Carl, the point was not, listen to me, I have a Nobel Prize. He said, my Nobel Prize gives me no credibility whatsoever on the teaching of physics. Here's my data from the courses I've taught and how they've changed and what the change in student. And that did come from his study of the educational literature. But it wasn't a how-to, it was, look at what you're not paying attention to.
So it comes down to philosophy, isn't it? What is your philosophy to knowledge? How does,
that
your
makes it much too
approach
pure.
almost.
I think what's, I don't know, how much of the field do you see as a football player, and what don't you see?
And in a sense, I mean, Brenda, your concern with the intersections of social justice with teaching and learning is precisely where that gains meaning, right?
Well, myself and two of my colleagues wrote a piece for a book on transformation. And then they said to us, well, what is the link between social justice and the scholarship of teaching and learning? And we had to make an argument to show that if you approach it in a particular way, and you're more reflective, and you question your assumptions more, and you're looking for specific things, then you can push that kind of agenda. But it doesn't mean that all scholarship of teaching and learning has a social justice agenda. It can just be straight efficiency, for one thing. And so it depends a lot on how you view teaching and what you think is important in teaching. But can I just say something a bit maybe maverick or odd, but I love show and tell. And I think a conference in which a lecturer comes and just shows you one of these brilliant ideas they had, and that's inspiring, and sometimes there's no scholarship behind it, or, you know.
Yeah. That's interesting, because you said philosophy, and Lee was saying, well, maybe not, but there's a perhaps tenuous link, but and what you're describing to me is, to some extent anyway, and exactly what you described, Lee, the colleague Carl that you referred to, the Nobel Prize winner, what you're both talking about is a phrase that I use quite often, and that they display a curiosity imperative.
Yeah.
All the time. It's more than just reflection, actually. But we try and actually, and I unashamedly try and bring a Popperian approach to the way that we think we teach. So, falsify rather than verify, question. We try and get people to teach that way, and hopefully then produce students that we inculcate with a curiosity imperative. But it actually requires the teachers to have that curiosity imperative.
Absolutely.
So we consciously use the phrase.
Yeah. I suppose what, again, coming back to this notion of scholarship, right? What do you do with that then? What do you do with being a critically reflective teacher? Where does it go? Certainly in our requirements for promotion, we all have to do this teaching portfolios, and it has to be evidence-led, whatever that means, and you have to, but what happens to it if our discomfort that we have here, and it's an acknowledged one, and certainly I would think valid, what happens to it? Where does it go? Does it stay in that portfolio? What happens to that scholarship? Because I do believe you are producing scholarship when you write up your teaching statement for your promotion or whatever, right? So what happens to it?
I'm not sure if this addresses what you, I may have lost the thread a little bit there, but certainly for our staff, it's not just an internal thing, but we very, very actively promote fellowship in various categories for the Higher Education Academy. So there's that external recognition, professional recognition as well. And our target for staff there is an improbable, but 100% of staff to have fellowship of some sort of status. So whether we
does
ever
that still exist? The Higher Education
Academy
does. Okay.
Their budget's been slashed significantly.
Yeah. Okay.
But they exist and indeed still thrive in many ways as well. And they, for example, getting back to where Jenny was speaking about earlier on, we run an internal but accredited by the Higher Education Academy postgraduate certificate for higher education. The expectation is that every single member of staff coming in and sort of the old hands as well, up to a point, have to have a postgraduate cert in higher education teaching. Now, some of that, interestingly, and you're using some terms earlier on I suppose, we'd all say that universities aren't in the business of training. We're there to educate, etc. But some of that is actually training, and that's actually fine.
But it's also the case, I think, that we're in the age of, I wish I could write the obituary today that would be written 15 years from now, and it's the obituary for what we now call journals. And do you realize how much garbage gets through high-impact, highly regarded journals like Lancet and Science? And, no, I'm very serious.
And Nature?
And Nature. I mean, the fact is that in a world filled with social media, can you imagine nothing appearing on Facebook till it was peer-reviewed? Now, some of that might have been a blessing. But on the other hand, the point is we have the wherewithal to do what Steve has described, for knowledge to be open. Instead of 3 anonymous peers making a judgment about your work, 100 peers who read it and get bored after 1 paragraph make that judgment. No, I'm very serious. I mean, we have the wherewithal for all of scholarship, whether it's teaching and learning, or clinical diagnosis, or material science, or whatever, being much more openly available one to another, including work on the teaching and learning of those.
I think I'm more old-fashioned than you on that, Lee.
Oh, good.
So I want to raise a flag for peer review. I think, and for journals, and so for some kind of idea that there's a community that puts knowledge out. To me, the perversity is because of the incentives that have pushed people. Have you done your 3 articles a year? It says only a generation ago where the average lecturer at UCT would retire as a senior lecturer, being a good person who taught maths to second years for a couple of decades, was loved by their students, and engineers had gone out to be engineers. And maybe might not have even done a PhD, maybe would have completed a PhD. And then there would be, the odds, there would be the rock stars who got excited about doing research and became professors. Remember this, the salaries were not that much differentiated. So this is the big shift in our context, is now there's a massive pay increase if you can get promotion. It's associated with research, and for universities, it's big bucks if you can get your academics producing those journal articles. This is the cycle that has shifted our valuing of things. So, I mean, look, the downside of Facebook where everything just goes out is actually increasingly, it's really hard. There's so much junk out there. I mean, I read a thing this morning, Desmond Tutu had died, and I was, and then I saw, and it's not actually Times Live, it's a hoax site. I mean, the man is actually crucially ill, but there's just junk all over the place for all weird reasons. And I think even if I look at how people make decisions, if I look at social media and how people make decisions about their health and so on, it's quite hard. You would think you'd be getting better knowledge, but you're actually not as a general person in the world trying to decide things.
Yeah, so this I mean, to come back to the differentiation, which Lee, you said has been sort of taken and gone in a different direction from what you intended by those 3 categories of scholarship of teaching and learning, educational research, and scholarly teaching. Is there, perhaps from what I'm hearing, I mean, granted it's a continuum, but the focus with those imperatives that we have in higher education to publish or perish has pushed us to the scholarship of teaching and learning, when perhaps we should be moving more on that continuum to scholarly teaching and being more reflexive there and see what develops from there, rather than making, I think you talk about it, Jenny, as a product, that the end product has to be that scholarship appears in some journal, right?
Not all of the scholarship of teaching and learning is studies of teaching, one's own or someone else's. I spent 10 years doing research on how physicians made medical diagnoses. Another part of my life. As part of a medical faculty interested in developing a problem-based curriculum for teaching medical students. We did almost no research studying the teaching of medicine. But one of the results of our research was the recognition that the ability to make medical diagnoses was not a general skill, but was very domain specific. And that just because you can do beautifully skillful diagnoses in hematology doesn't mean that if a patient walked into your office with a gastroenterological problem, you could also diagnose it because it was a matter of applying a skill. Well, that work ended up having an enormous impact on the teaching and evaluation of physicians because it led to a change in the organization of teaching and the kind of assessment of medical of physicians. But it wasn't studies of techniques of teaching, but I would call it on the spectrum within the domain of a scholarship of teaching and learning.
Right.
And but the other thing I guess I would simply comment is that one of the other fallacies about, quote, real research is that it generalizes to all other situations. When my friend Carl Wyman did his research with a particular population of undergraduate students at the time at the University of Colorado Boulder, it was beautiful. The measurement was precise. It met all the methodological concerns that Brenda, you and I share. And but if you ask me, are you prepared now to generalize that research to the design of all courses in 7 other universities? I'd say, well, it's probably not a bad starting point. But I would assume that it would work differently in different contexts. And therefore, we've got to keep on documenting and measuring. We've got to do it with a certain air of skepticism and care, because the scholarship of teaching is iterative and self-correcting in that way. You don't get a generalization and say, flipped classrooms, let's turn all classrooms on their head. We have a new magic. We don't.
Or do all conferencing this way. Brenda, how would that work in a chair of teaching and learning? I mean, what do you, how does the scholarship of teaching and learning feature in your, sorry, I'm putting you on the spot there, Brenda.
Well, I mean, there isn't such a thing as a chair. It's a fairly unusual institution. I don't know of another one in this country, and I don't know if there are any in any other countries. So I think it's interesting that my university saw fit to create one. I credit them for that. So I'm not sure that there are. Well, let me maybe perhaps say that I don't think we've had the conversation in South Africa to say, well, how do we understand scholarship of teaching and learning, like we're having here today? And that could be a very valuable conversation to have, because these international perspectives are very valuable. But I really would like to see this conversation go many steps further.
Is there a place, this is a fairly provocative question, but maybe to everyone, but particularly to you, Brenda. Is there a place for, how would I frame this, for intuitive decision-making on teaching and learning practice rather than scholarship-based? Let me try and give you an example. Let's say that and it's a slightly different world that I inhabit now, but let's say that where people are obsessed with scores in the National Student Survey, where those things appear in league tables, and as much as we say they don't matter, they have to some extent. But leave that aside for the moment. So let's say that a particular university gets lambasted for its assessment feedback times, which varies not just within but across universities, say in the UK, and ranges between 3 to 5 weeks, and with laggards stretching into 10 weeks, and so on and so on. Intuitively, it makes sense to say we want reduced feedback times for reasons such as currency of feedback is more important for them, it's more likely to be of use in a formative sense, and so on. And leaving aside other things such as for example, staggering assessments, and perhaps making adjustments to the amount of assessing that you do, and so on. If you could reduce your feedback times significantly while maintaining, through other mechanisms, the quality of feedback to students, that just seems like a good thing.
Well, I think some people are a little rude about
You don't need to theorize it.
Sorry. People are a little bit rude about what they call craft knowledge. But I think it's very important, and
glad to hear you.
legitimated. But what I want to say to you is an intuitive decision could be right or it could be wrong. The fact that it's
Intuition's a very unreliable guy.
So it could
Lots
go
of
either
things.
way. But now, if you want to sell that idea to someone else, then you need to go back and see, well, did it work? And if it worked, why did it work? So you might want to unpack it with a bit more scholarly work. But I think good teaching is absolutely intuitive a lot of the time. And so it should be. And if you read research on teaching, it should also appeal to your sense of having been a teacher. You know, yes, this makes sense to me.
But to come back to what makes it scholarship then, right? About, you know, how much of methodological, theoretical rigor is required to turn that into scholarship. And to come back to this idea of whether someone, you know, a scholar in anthropology or, you know, a discipline like psychology could actually publish on scholarship, you know, of teaching and learning, and what would it take to do that? And is it, I mean, are we doing intellectual gatekeeping by saying, no, actually you're doing a disservice to educational researchers? Or do we understand, for example, the PhD as giving you the necessary skills to be able to engage in research across a wide range of disciplines, especially research that, for example, research in social justice, right? I'm in the, you know, gender studies and religion studies, but certainly I can identify, I can read research in social justice education, I can understand it, and I think I could very well publish in that, right? So it's about how we understand the skills that we acquire from our PhDs, for those who have PhDs, given that.
You see, that's why disciplinary depth is so important, because many of us encourage people to do that research on their teaching in a way that's cognate with their methods of inquiry.
Yes.
So if you're a social scientist or something, you're more likely to look at those issues, and as opposed to someone perhaps in the sciences who some people, maybe perhaps more the numeric people, who would want to look at things more numerically and quantitatively. That's a skill that they're more familiar with. I'm not saying you should stick with your skill, but I think that disciplinary depth is essential to facilitate inquiry.
See, I almost feel a bit like Stephen's point here.
My mother always used to call me Stephen when she was cross with me.
Yes, of
course. Yeah, I was having a scholarly conversation with a colleague the other day, actually, who's been nominated for this Teaching and Learning Award that you, and she was saying, you know, what did you do in this talk? And I said, I really just spoke very practically about teaching. For example, that I think it's worthwhile getting to know people's names in your class, even if it's a cohort of 120. And she said, I do that as well. But she said, I spent a whole semester calling someone Richard. And at the end he said, by the way, I'm Mike. I had this nervous moment that we've been in this whole conversation. I've been using the wrong. But I mean, that's really, so I do think, that's the sort of thing of, a lot of the stuff you do as a teacher, it's about where you invest time. I do think something that's completely underrated in university is, if you are going to be in a classic academic position, we're doing research 40% of your time, academic teaching 40%, admin 20%. You can't spend 30 hours producing PowerPoint slides. You know, well, you need to decide: are you going to do that? What matters? You know, you can't. That I don't think we talk enough about. Is how do we efficiently use our time? How do we even efficiently do the administration with big courses? And I don't think those things are going to justify journal articles. But there's a lot of bad practice in the university.
Right.
There's things that you would get fired for in a high school, in a decent high school, in terms of people's professional activities. And I wanted to pick up on, this is not quite, it's a little bit linked, but a little bit not. You know, you mentioned decolonizing. Well, the questions that have been raised about higher education in South Africa, let's just say, and to what degree is our system really appropriate to the country that we're in, as opposed to being something imported from elsewhere. And I love the story of Carl Wyman's, taking on education as a Nobel Prize physicist. And I know that's a big thing. All the physics ed colleagues I have, they always mention Carl Wyman. It meant something. But on the other hand, sometimes those role models are so, like, of course Carl Weiman did brilliant stuff also in teaching in a way, because there are those sort of amazing, physics seems to breed these kind of people. But most of us are just more regular individuals. It comes back to my thing of, you know, the university, we're not all Stanford or where was it, you know, we're not all, most of those top-end American universities we know live in another universe. I don't want to say we don't aspire to be good, but I worry if we're sort of chasing something, then we lose everything. Like if someone who's not grounded in their discipline, then they try to do sort of like fancy pedagogies, and then it's just terrible. And you would rather say, stick with the textbook, get the feedback on time, and be systematic, you know, whatever. I don't know. I've said a few things there. Just
be a good teacher.
What do students need at the end of the day? And when we're producing, and then for sure, I'd love physics people to all have good attitudes to physics and so on. And all teachers should be agonizing about it. It doesn't surprise me Carl Weiman had a whole study and a measurement and so on.
Well, Carl began this work before he got a Nobel Prize and continued it afterwards. It was not. But I guess I want to reassure Stephen that Steve, and I want to sound like Mom, that speaking personally as well as to the other people on the panel that I know and others, almost all good research begins in intuition and isn't worth a damn unless it stimulates the intuitions of others.
That's right.
Some philosopher once said philosophy begins in wonder and ends in algebra. But really good philosophy ends in more wonder, stimulates people to think. And the worst thing we could do would be to assassinate intuition. On the other hand, if someone tells me I've got this powerful intuition about teaching, whether it's for social justice or for a deep understanding of engineering, I think it's fair for me to say, God, that's a lovely thought. How do you know? Why should I believe you? Because that's really what disciplines are about.
Yes.
I love you, but why should I believe you?
Yes, yes. And in a sense, I think when you take it towards, you know, the issue of scholarship, really what, for me, what has been helpful in developing my own teaching practice into scholarship is, I think it answered for me the so what question. I think I'm a good teacher. I do what I do, but so what? What? You know, how do I make sense of that? And I think perhaps to be more authentic, it's about making sense for yourself first. That's how I understand it. That doing that work was about making sense of what I do for myself, and then then asking, well, how does that intersect with what others are doing and how others have spoken about this? But I see that we've come to the end of our time, and I'm really grateful for this very stimulating conversation, and look forward to your papers and your workshops and the rest of the conference with you. Any parting words, maybe from, are you happy to close here? Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I wish you all the best.